An old woman with deep-set eyes sat motionless in the darkness at 2 a.m., and she was waiting for me. I didn't know that yet. I was walking down a hospice corridor in Lufkin, Texas, running on 3 hours of broken sleep and bad vending machine coffee, and the last thing I expected was for a stranger in a wheelchair to raise one finger at me from the shadow of her doorway and say, quiet as a held breath, come here a minute, don't wake the nurses. I almost kept walking. I almost told myself she was confused, medicated, mixing me up with someone else. That almost cost me everything. My name is Cecil Morrow. I'm 61 years old. For 32 years, I coordinated freight logistics for a regional shipping company out of Corpus Christi, Texas, the kind of job where you read contracts before you sign them and verify every invoice twice. Not because anyone tells you to, but because that's just how you're wired. My late wife Lucinda used to say I was the only man she'd ever met who read the terms and conditions on a blender warranty. She wasn't wrong. I tell you all of this because I want you to understand the kind of man I thought I was. A careful man. A man who didn't get fooled. And I want you to understand that careful men get fooled too, when the person doing the fooling is someone they love. A few things before I go further. Some names and details in this story have been changed to protect people who are still living and to honor people who aren't. But the heart of what happened is real. It happened. And the reason I'm telling it is because somewhere out there, someone needs to hear it before they walk into a room that looks exactly like the one I almost walked out of without thinking twice. My older brother's name was Randall, Randy to anyone who knew him. He was 4 years older than me and had been, for most of my life, the only stable thing in it. Our father left when I was 9 and Randy was 13, and from that spring on, Randy was the one who showed up. He taught me how to work on an engine, how to shake a man's hand and look him in the eye, how to keep going when you didn't feel like it. He built a life with his hands, literally. He bought a piece of land on Lake Toledo Bend in the late 70s for almost nothing, and he built a cabin on it himself over 3 years of weekends. That cabin was the thing in his life he was most proud of. Not the money it eventually became worth, but the fact that his own hands had made it. By the time I got the call, Randy had pancreatic cancer and maybe days left. I drove 6 hours from Corpus Christi to Lufkin on a Tuesday, and I barely remember packing. 2 shirts, a razor, a phone charger. I got to the hospice at dusk, and the woman at the front desk had the particular look that hospice workers develop: calm, practiced, something soft behind the eyes that comes from watching a lot of people say goodbye. She told me Randy had been asking for me. She also told me my nephew Preston was expected the following morning, flying in from Houston. Randy was barely 90 pounds when I walked into his room. His hands shook when he reached for me, but his mind was there, sharp and present behind the exhaustion. And the first thing he said when I got close enough was, "Preston been here yet?" I told him no, not until morning. He nodded, but he didn't look relieved. He looked like a man still waiting for something he wasn't sure he wanted to arrive. I didn't understand that look then. I should have. Across the hall from Randy's room was a woman I'll call Mrs. Caldwell. I learned her first name later, Ruth. She was in her mid-70s, stage 4, something I never asked about, and in the 4 days I spent at that hospice, I never saw a single visitor come for her. Once a day, she'd sit in the common room doing a crossword puzzle in pen, which told me everything I needed to know about her confidence in herself. I said hello the first afternoon. She nodded back, politely, said nothing more. The second day, I brought her a muffin from the family kitchen. She said thank you, and that was all. I felt sorry for her in the way you feel sorry for anyone facing something enormous and facing it alone. The third night, something shifted. I'd been sitting beside Randy for hours, holding his hand while the oxygen concentrator clicked and the dark pressed flat against the window. Around midnight, I stepped out to clear my head. As I passed Mrs. Caldwell's room, I saw her light was on low and she was sitting up awake. She looked directly at me. She said, flat and calm, "Your brother's been talking in his sleep." I stopped. She said, "The nurses come and go, but I hear through the wall. He keeps saying he should have changed the will, over and over, like he's trying to remind himself of something he can't hold on to anymore." I thanked her and told myself she was a lonely woman, filling the silence with what she heard through the walls. I went back to Randy's room and sat in the dark and dismissed it. And then came the second night, the one that mattered. Past 2 in the morning, I just stepped into the corridor while the night nurse changed Randy's IV line. I was walking toward the vending machine when I saw Mrs. Caldwell's door open. She was in her wheelchair right in the center of the doorway, still as stone, watching the hall. She raised one finger at me, not a wave. A beckoning, the kind that means come here, quietly. I pulled the visitor's chair over and sat down across from her. The lamp was low. Her eyes were pale gray and very clear, and she looked at me for a long moment before she said anything. Your nephew gets in tomorrow, she said. I said yes. Your brother told a nurse last night when he was half out of his mind. He said the boy was coming and he was afraid of what the boy was going to do. He said it 3 times. I felt something cold drop through my chest. I had a son, she said, quiet, even. He's the reason I'm in here alone. Whatever your nephew tells you when he gets here, don't believe it. Don't sign anything he puts in front of you. Drive home tonight if you still can. I want to tell you what I did with that. I thanked her. I told her I was sorry about her son. And then I walked back to my brother's room and I sat in the dark and I told myself she was a sad woman who'd been hurt by her own family and was casting that shadow onto mine. Preston was my nephew. I'd been at his christening. I'd taken him fishing on Toledo Bend when he was 8 years old, and he'd laughed so hard he nearly fell out of the boat. I dismissed her. That was my first mistake. Preston arrived at 11 the next morning in a pressed charcoal blazer, hair neat, smile right on time. He hugged me before he even crossed to his father's bedside. He smelled like aftershave and airport coffee, and he held the hug 1 beat longer than it needed to go. I noticed that. I filed it under nothing. He sat with Randy for maybe 10 minutes, said the right things, held his father's hand, kept his voice low and easy. At one point, Randy turned and looked at me over Preston's shoulder, his mouth open like he was trying to say something and then closed again without a sound. Just his eyes on mine, wet and tired and full of something he couldn't get out. I'll carry that moment the rest of my life. After about an hour, Preston touched my arm. Uncle Cecil, can we step down to the cafeteria? I want to talk about the arrangements. We sat across from each other at a laminate table under fluorescent light. Preston put his hands flat on the surface, completely flat, like a man setting down cards, and he said, Dad's been worried about the lake property, the Toledo Bend cabin. Randy had built it with his own hands. It sat on 2 lakefront acres and was worth somewhere near $800,000 by any honest estimate. Randy had lived in it alone since his wife Marguerite passed in 2017. Preston said, he wants me to handle the transfer. The thing is, Uncle Cecil, he's not going to make it through the week. Doctor told me this morning, 48 hours, maybe less. There's paperwork that needs his signature while he can still hold a pen. Otherwise, it all goes to probate, and you know how that goes. 2 years of lawyers eating half the value. I did know how that went. I'd watched a friend of mine lose 1/3 of his mother's estate to legal fees after she passed without proper documents in place. Preston said, Dad asked me to draft a quitclaim deed. Keeps the cabin out of probate, puts it in my name, so I can manage the sale and cover his final expenses. Simple. We've got a notary coming in this afternoon. We just need you there as the witness, Uncle Cecil. That's all. He looked at me with the calm of a man explaining a grocery list, like none of this was anything but ordinary. I said, what about your sister? Preston has a sister, Dina. She teaches at a community college outside Beaumont, 2 kids, quiet life. She and Preston have never been close, and I hadn't seen her in 4 years. Preston said, Dina's not in the will for the cabin. That's always been the arrangement. Dad and Mom set it up years ago. She gets the life insurance and the savings. The cabin was always mine to handle. This is just paperwork. I said I'd like to see the documents before the notary arrived. His smile stayed exactly the same. But something behind his eyes did a small, quiet thing. Like a door swinging shut in the back of a house you thought you knew. He said, Of course, Uncle Cecil. Whatever makes you comfortable. And that was when Ruth Caldwell's voice came back to me like a cold hand on my shoulder. I went upstairs. I sat beside Randy. I watched him sleep, and I thought about his hands when they were strong. About the first wall of that cabin going up and him calling me from a payphone to say he was proud and he needed to tell someone. I thought about my nephew's face when I'd asked to see the paperwork. The smile that stayed while something behind it went somewhere else entirely. Around 4 that afternoon, a man in a brown suit appeared in the hallway with a leather briefcase. Notary. Preston came out of Randy's room smiling, shook the man's hand like an old acquaintance, and the two of them moved toward the door together. I stood up. I said, "I'm coming in." Preston said, "Of course, come on in. We just need your signature as the witness." The notary had a stack of documents spread across the adjustable tray over Randy's bed. Randy was awake but drifting, his eyes tracking between me and Preston slowly, like a man trying to locate himself in a room he half recognized. I asked to see the papers. The notary handed me the top sheet. Quitclaim deed, transferring the Toledo Bend property to Preston Morrow. That part was exactly what Preston had described. But underneath it was a second document, and underneath that, a third. The second was a durable power of attorney making Preston the sole agent over all of Randall Morrow's financial affairs, effective immediately. The third was an assignment of beneficiary on a life insurance policy, a union policy through Randy's old carpenter's local, worth $420,000. The beneficiary line had been freshly typed with Preston's name, and just barely visible in the carbon copy underneath faint but legible was Dana's name. The one that had been there before, 3 documents, stacked in order. In a room where my brother was dying, I stood there and I felt the air change. Something quiet and cold moved through me. I thought, this is what it looks like. This is what it looks like when someone has been waiting a long time and has decided this is the last chance. I said, "Preston, what are these other 2? He said, "Protective measures, Uncle Cecil. In case Dad's situation changes quickly and someone needs to act on his behalf." I said, "He's dying in 48 hours. His situation isn't going to change in a direction that requires a power of attorney." Preston said, "Uncle Cecil, please." I said, "Why is Dana's name replaced on the life insurance?" He said, "Dina agreed to that." I said, "Did she?" That door behind his eyes swung shut again. The notary was looking back and forth between us, with the expression of a man rapidly revising his understanding of what kind of afternoon he'd walked into. I said I needed a moment alone with my brother and my nephew. The notary stepped out. I closed the door. I turned around and looked at Preston and I said very quietly, "Call your sister right now. Speakerphone." He said, "Uncle Cecil, you're exhausted. You've been here too long. You're not thinking straight." I said, "Call her or I will." He didn't move. I took out my phone. Found Dina's number 4 years since I'd used it, still right there in my contacts, and she picked up on the second ring. I put her on speaker. I said, "Dina, it's Uncle Cecil. I'm at the hospice with your father and your brother and a notary. Did you agree to be removed as the beneficiary on your father's union life insurance policy?" There was a silence. The kind of silence that takes a moment to fill because the person on the other end needs to be certain they heard you correctly. She said, slowly, "Uncle Cecil, what policy? What are you talking about?" I said, "Did you agree to it?" She said, "I don't know what you're talking about." And then Preston was already moving, already talking over her. "Dina, hey, listen, this is just a misunderstanding. The documents are purely protective." She said, "Preston, what did you do?" He said, "Dina, calm down." She said, "Uncle Cecil, don't sign anything. I will be on a flight tonight. Don't let them touch a single thing. Do you hear me?" I hung up. The room went very quiet. I could hear the oxygen concentrator clicking. I could hear Randy breathing on the bed. I looked at my nephew standing there in his charcoal blazer, briefcase in hand, and I thought about the 8-year-old boy I'd taken fishing on Toledo Bend, the one who'd laughed until he nearly went overboard. I understood in that moment that boy was not standing in front of me. There was someone else looking out of Preston's eyes. Someone calculating. Someone who was already, even now, thinking about what came next. He said, "You don't understand the financial situation here. Dad owes me. Years of me covering things, sending money, taking care of problems nobody else was willing to touch. I deserve something back for that." I said, "Get out of this room." He picked up his briefcase. He gathered the 3 documents off the tray. He walked out without another word. Honestly, and I'll be straight with you here, I don't fully know how I held myself together in that moment. I've thought about it many times since. I sat down on the edge of Randy's bed. I took his hand. He was looking at me. He was crying without making a sound, just tears sliding down into the pillow beside him. And I don't know how much of what had just happened had reached him through the fog of the morphine. but some part of him understood enough. I could see it. I said, "It's done, Randy." I stopped it. "It's all right." He squeezed my hand once, as hard as he could manage, which wasn't much, but I felt it. He passed 30 hours later on a Thursday morning, just before the sun came up over the pine trees east of Lufkin. Dina had flown in overnight. We were both there. Preston wasn't. The following week, Dina and I sat across from Randy's attorney, a woman named Marguerite Fontenot, out of Jasper, Texas, who had handled my brother's affairs for 16 years. She pulled up the real will. The Toledo Bend cabin was to be sold and proceeds split equally between Preston and Dina. The life insurance, all $420,000, was Dina's entirely. The savings, just under $100,000, was divided between the two children and a scholarship fund at the trade school where Randy had done his apprenticeship in 1971. Every single one of those provisions, Preston's documents would have reversed nearly all of them. Marguerite looked across her desk at me and said, "Do you know what would have happened if you'd signed those papers?" I said I did now. She said, "What made you hesitate?" I told her about Mrs. Caldwell, the woman across the hall, the one who'd stopped me in the dark at 2 a.m. and told me to drive home while I still could. I drove back to Lufkin the following Saturday. I'd brought a box of pastries from a bakery Dina had recommended and a handwritten card. The nurse at the front desk recognized me. Her face changed when I asked for Mrs. Caldwell by room number. Ruth Caldwell had passed on Wednesday, quietly, in her sleep, 2 days before I came back. Her daughter hadn't yet come to collect her things. The nurse was quiet for a long moment and then asked, "Were you close?" I said no. I'd spoken to her exactly twice. But she had done something for me I would never be able to repay. The nurse said, "Wait here." She came back holding a sealed envelope. My name on the front in thin, slanted handwriting. She said Ruth had left it at the front desk on Wednesday morning. Said to give it to me if I came back and to throw it away if I didn't. I went outside and sat on a concrete bench in the cold November air and opened it. One sheet of paper, folded once. It said, "Mr. Morrow, I don't know whether you listened to me or not. I hope you did. My son's name is Darnell. In the spring of 2011, he took everything I had, the house, the retirement account, the jewelry my husband gave me over 40 years of marriage. I have spent 14 years in rooms like this one, in apartments smaller than this room, in places I never imagined I would end up. And the worst part is not the losing. The worst part is that nobody warned me. I had a sister-in-law who knew what Darnell was. She told me afterward that she had suspected for years, but felt it wasn't her place to say anything. I decided that day that if I ever saw it happening to someone else, I would say something, that it would be my place. So I said something to you. Whatever happened, I hope you are safe. Ruth Caldwell. I sat on that bench for a long time. I don't know how long. The cold didn't reach me. At some point, a hospice volunteer came outside and asked if I was all right, and I told her yes, I was fine. I was just sitting a while. It wasn't her place. And she made it her place anyway. That decision made alone in a hospice room by a woman who had every reason in the world to close her eyes and let me walk past that decision kept my brother's final wishes intact. It kept Dina from losing $400,000 in the worst week of her life. It kept me from being the man who'd signed away his own brother's estate and spent the rest of his days trying to live with what he'd done. I want to stop here and say something honestly, because I think you deserve it. When Preston was sitting across from me in that cafeteria, laying his hands flat on the table, I almost believed him. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't hurrying. He wasn't sweating through the explanation. He was calm the way only someone can be calm when they've been telling themselves a version of the story long enough that they believe it. That's what I learned in that cafeteria. The most dangerous lie isn't the one told with panic in the voice. It's the one told with patience. If you've ever sat across from someone you loved and felt a slow, quiet wrongness you couldn't name, you know exactly what I mean. You file it under nothing, the way I filed that hug. You tell yourself you're tired or suspicious or reading things in. But something in you is doing the math, and the math is coming out different from the story you're being told. That feeling is information. It deserves to be treated as information. About 6 months after the funeral, a letter arrived from a woman in Houston I'd never heard of. Her father had passed in the spring, and going through his things, she'd found a small notebook where he'd written down the names of people who owed him money and never paid. Preston Morrow was in that notebook with a dollar amount next to his name, $42,000. Borrowed and gone. She'd found my information through Randy's obituary. I called her. We talked for over an hour. Her father had been in his 80s, a proud man who'd never told his children he was being cheated because he was ashamed. He'd only written it in a notebook after the fact. She'd found it when he was already gone. I called Dina. Dina called Marguerite Fontenot. Marguerite started looking into it. What we found was that Preston had been running versions of this for years. Not just family, former clients, Randy's old friends, elderly men in his commercial insurance network who trusted him because they trusted Randy. He had close to $300,000 in unsecured personal debt, 2 civil suits pending in Harris County, and a gambling problem that had been compounding in the background for at least 5 years. The lake cabin scheme at the hospice had been his last real play. If he'd gotten that property, he could have borrowed against it that same week and bought himself another 6 months ahead of what was already collapsing. He went to trial 18 months after Randy died. Not for what he'd tried to do in that hospice room that would have been difficult to prove as fraud, and Dina and I had what mattered. He went to trial for what he'd done to the woman's father and 2 other elderly clients in the Houston area. He received a 5-year sentence. He is still serving it. Dina writes to him sometimes. I haven't. His daughter, my great niece, 11 years old, now lives with her mother and Katie. I send a birthday card every year and a check at Christmas. Her mother sends a thank you note back. I don't expect more than that. That little girl didn't choose who her father was, and I want her to know that somebody in her family holds her in mind and thinks of her kindly. That somebody on her father's side looked at her and saw her, just her, separate from all of it. About a year after the trial, Dina and I started something small. No name, no nonprofit filing, no official structure. We go in once a month, her through a senior outreach program near Beaumont, me through a church group in Corpus Christi, and we sit and talk and listen. We tell what happened. We tell Ruth Caldwell's story with her daughter's full blessing. And I cannot tell you how many times I have heard my own story told back to me with different names. A son who just needs one signature before the weekend. A grandson who's been helping with the accounts and would love to be added to the deed just to simplify things. A daughter who knows just the right financial advisor. It would only take one meeting. It happens every day in every state to people who read fine print and balance their checkbooks and believe that the ones who could never hurt them were the ones who shared their blood. I keep Ruth's letter folded in the drawer of my nightstand. I take it out sometimes and read it. I think about how easy it would have been for her to let me walk past that night. She was dying. She had been devastated by her own family. She had every reason in the world to close her eyes and rest in the time she had left. And she didn't. She spent her last energy on a stranger she'd talked to exactly twice. She saved my brother's last wishes. She saved my niece's inheritance. She saved me from being the man I would have had to be afterward, and that man would have been very hard to live inside. So let me say to you now, directly, whoever you are and wherever you're listening from, if something in your family has been gnawing at you, some arrangement that moved too fast, some document you were told not to worry about reading, some deadline that appeared out of nowhere, trust that feeling. Look at it. Name it out loud to someone who has nothing to gain. The cost of being wrong is a little awkwardness, maybe a bruised relationship for a few weeks. The cost of being right and saying nothing is somebody's whole life, somebody's life's work, somebody's last wishes, the ones they made when they still could. Here's the one thing I'll ask you to do today if you take anything from this. If someone is pushing you to sign something before the notary leaves, before your mother wakes up, before the attorney's office closes, slow down. Take a photograph of every page. Call one